Welcome to today's podcast. Today's podcast is about from the Capet Institute of String Pedagogical Institute is about bow hand posture. This is very basic, but there is a lot of research on it, and there's a lot of agreeing people that agree with most of the things that I'm going to talk about today. So without further ado, let's get into it. Hi, my name is Dr. Kelly Johnson, and my research has dealt with comparisons of different teachers on different techniques. Most recently, though, I've focused on Capet, and that is what we're going to pull everything into, is how Capet works with all of these things, and then why I feel Capet is the way we should be teaching for long-term playing and ease of playing. So this is a chart. It's very handwritten, but I think we can get around to most of the information on it fairly quickly. So there are different parts of your hand, and let's start out with the thumb. The thumb and the middle finger, almost every teacher agrees that that is a balance in your hand. And so if I were going to show you what that means the thumb is curved. Well, there's not a lot of dark place there. I'm a dark place. Here we go. Yes. So we turn that thumb a little bit. It goes underneath the bow, and the fingers naturally come over it. Generally like this, so that the middle finger and the thumb create a ring. That ring is a spring action, and many teachers teach something like this. Set of springs like the springs in your car, not leaf springs, but they're kind of like that. So when you go over a bump, they compress, and then when they release, coming over the other side of the bump to keep the car from diving down, those stiff springs open up and stiffen up, so they compress coming over, and then they decompress coming off, so that basically you have a smooth ride. And that's important if you're trying to play a smooth note and you have a space, an open space here where the angle is very large, and then a smaller space here where the angle to your instrument is very small. I'll show you that in a moment. In fact, that's kind of an important thing, so let me show you really fast. Okay. So if we hold our instrument and we put the bow at the tip, see if I can lift this up. Now if you can see, there is about, from this place here where my bow is contacting the string down to where my hand is, about 3 feet. As we come up, that angle decreases consistently until we have equilibrium here at the frog. So that's where your fingers should be the lowest to take the weight of the bow here, and then when we get to the tip, and there's some mechanisms in between, but that's a large angle there. When we come to the middle, that's a smaller angle. It's interesting how the tip and the frog both move at the same degrees of angle. And then here, where the angle here at the frog is very small, but the angle for the tip is very large. Okay? It's kind of basic mechanics. Then a very important part of what I was just doing is, because I had the balance in the bow here in the middle, I'll show you on a pencil again. So the balance of the bow is in the middle, then the pinky here sits on top, and the first finger comes down. And the downward motion of these fingers are a counterbalance to the upward motion of the thumb. So the thumb pushes up, and the fingers push down, and together they have a counterbalance. Now that's really important, that counterbalance. Galamian, Capet, Ivan Fisher, I'll talk about problems happening when that counterbalance goes awry. Now, when they said counterbalance, they're actually talking about two different counterbalances. This is just one of them. But this counterbalance, I agree with, totally, completely. This is very important to have, not tension, because you still need a very movable hand, and all the springs need to be very flexible. And sometimes they're stiff, depending on what you need to play, like martelet bowing, fast movement, and then a strong reaction, or a very stiff staccato. Very important to have a tighter hold on that spring, so the spring's not so soft. But if you're going to play legato, you have to have a very soft spring. So the tension in that differs depending on what is necessary. So the balance is there, and then last piece of all is this ring finger. And the ring finger actually is quite important. If you want to play louder, then that ring finger will just add to the loudness. Or if the softness, that ring finger just softens up and increases the volume control, the accent control, all of those things that you do with your hand, that is the accentuator of the things you do. So it's a sensitivity finger. Okay, so great. So let's move on to the wrist and the finger flexibility. Now, the more research I do, the more I realize there's kind of really two different, basically really different ways of bowing. There's some different hand shapes. So here, when I was showing you this one, the French school, which is Bayeux, and down to Capet, taught 4 equal fingers. So there's no leaning over of this finger, but there's 4. I call these my 4 little Indians. So 1, 2, 3, 4 little Indians, all sitting very equally on that bow. And the fingers are equidistance apart. And then we have balances and movements. At the frog, it's pretty much the same. That hand position doesn't change a whole lot except for the, let me show you with the bow. The angle changes of the hand, of the fingers. The fingers themselves don't change all that much. And the pivot point is right here in the middle. Okay? This one, let's talk about this one. This is very early, and I'm sorry the screen is not flat. But this hand shape is really very particularly obvious around the turn of the 20th century with Leopold Auer and his students. And this one is this hand shape where all the fingers are pretty much straight, and the thumb is fairly straight except for just holding the bow. And the arm has to be very, very high, and you kind of have to play from the upper arm to get this one to work. We'll go into the mechanics in a minute, but this one is really centered around the upper arm and this shoulder muscle and the shoulder. It also lifts the right here, right in your shoulder, that muscle, or not the muscle, it is the muscle, but it also moves bones right in here. So you have to move those upward, and that all moves together. Okay, so that is the Auer method. Music in the Romantic era was fairly difficult, especially compared to earlier eras, but it hadn't achieved its highest complexity yet. So this was still viable for a lot of music. It's especially very smooth music, and it does have an incredible smoothness about it. So the next one that we kind of come up against is this, oh, and this one's also very Russian, old Russian school, but Russian. Very straight fingers, straight on the backs of the fingers, a lot of tension. The tension's released from this movement here. Now, coming into the Prussian here, that has so many names. So that's the one I decided to go with, okay? What that is just more flexibility in the fingers, but still kind of a focus on the first finger, but the fingers are still kind of equidistant. So this is Kreutzer VOT, and this still requires quite a high elbow to play. I think the idea is to get out of the way to get in this area. But there's a lot of tension that goes up in the back muscles to do that one, and a lot of tension here in the back of the arm here too. So again, if you've already learned how to play these ways, it's not necessarily worth it to change how you play, but it is, if you're teaching new students, to be aware of these things. Okay, and then Franco-Prussian really came as a combination of this school with this school, and then finally Galamian studied with Capet and the French school. So this is really what's been out there because Galamian was so famous and his book was so famous. So that one, of course, is the famous first finger out. And what's supposed to happen is that these fingers stay fairly curled, but oftentimes they get into that movement right there. Actually, no, that's the Prussian Kreutzer one. That one, okay, yeah, that one. Okay, so this one and this one are very similar. Sorry, I got those confused. So you see this a lot on students who, yeah, that's this from creating power. I can see like Beniowski using that, or actually not Beniowski himself. No, he maybe once in a while. But there was a lot of Russian players that played with that power from above feel. Don't take that the wrong way. It's not a spiritual commentary. And this one, which is the one that is mostly used all the way through the Suzuki world, and most people play this way, where these fingers are bent in the back and then the first finger is out, which require a fairly just uneven elbow mostly, but it's still higher mostly than the wrist at most times. Okay, so now we've worked our way down. Let's go back to the French school and look at what's going on here. Notice that everything is below. And the action of my camera is slow. The picture's good though. So there's different ways to make sound. So let's talk a little bit about the effectiveness of each one. These three things here you probably cannot see, so I will just kind of read them for you. The first one here is a crane. A crane action is where you're coming way from a very high position down into an object. And the balance comes from the shoulder here and counterbalancing that string there. Oh, and then the hand is neutral. It doesn't do much. Okay. The next one down is a mechanical arm, and you see this a lot of times, like on a printer, where there's a hand that holds, there's an arm that comes forward, and then the printer head, which is the hand, that does all the work. Okay, so, and then it's attached to a bow, so the bow becomes the worker, and this hand is an intermediate connection. Okay, so this works with the elbow giving the counterbalance to the string. So the elbow is putting pressure into the string, and so that's how you get your sound. Okay, and that's all of these. Like all of these two here are really the mechanical hand action here. This is definitely the crane action here. And then there's this one here, the French school, which is completely different. So I want to explain that a little bit. This one uses balanced and ballast, which are two different ideas, of course. There's two ways of balance, and of course you've got this one, which is very balanced hand. So the balance on the bow is perfect. You know, not as in the ideal, but as in it is perfectly balanced, equal on both sides. So there's an equal balance of the fingers here. I'll try to do it correctly. Okay, which is difficult because I have nothing under it. And then also the elbow balances the weight of the tip. So this is counterbalanced as well. So when you play a note, it acts in a different way. So let me talk to you about this swing analogy a little bit. So there's two ways to put weight on a swing. You can go over to the swing, and you can take your hands and you can place them on the seat of the swing. And what happens to the swing? Well, your feet are on the ground so that the swing doesn't move. But is there weight on the swing? Sure. There's about arm weight and a little bit of body weight on that string, or on that swing. And yes, we're talking about strings as well. So we put pressure on that or counter pressure on that. But what the key point here is that counter pressure tends to stop the swing. Now, with the crane action, of course, there's no feet, but the weight of this putting pressure on the string creates resistance, more resistance, but not a lot. Okay, so here's the alternative. Tell me if this is more or less weight. If you go and sit on a swing, obviously there's going to be like at least 4 times as much weight. I don't know how much that actually is. I'm imagining more like 10 times more weight, because you're releasing the entire weight of the body into the string or into the swing. And then when you pick your feet up, that moves the swing. And so what you have is that the top of the swing is solid here, and then the bottom, the weight is the ballast to that, and that counter, the pulse of the weight this way, moves that swing. So let's talk about which one of these applies where. Of course, you're probably already ahead of me. So the crane action maybe you would use that if you had an enormously heavy arm. I just thought of that. What if your weight was incredible? But still, it's a very light sound. It's not a very full sound. So coming into the string, if you put pressure into the string and then you try to make a sound, it won't make a sound because it's stopped, just like if you were pushing on that swing. But if you lower your elbow, and at some point it will start moving. If you raise it up, it will stop. Okay, so the case in point here is, how do we naturally get a sound? So sound doesn't naturally come with this one. It feels like it does, but it doesn't get as focused and effective sound with the hour or the Franco-Prussian or the Prussian or whatever you want to call it. There's so many terms to these, because they're coming from the top. So at no time is the elbow lower than the string, which means that at all times you're putting pressure on the string. That is not counter pressure. That's just pressure. There's no counter to it. The string is not pushing up. The tension of the string is not as sufficient to, it's barely sufficient, I should say, to hold that bow up. And it will make some sound, but it won't really make a lot of sound. So there are some teachers who teach that you play lighter, light pressure, and then heavy pressure to make sound. but I would like to talk about a different way to play. So let's talk about the counterbalance one. When you talk about counterbalancing, you don't have to have as much effort to counterbalance because it's use of gravity more. And just like I showed you a minute ago, where the sound started to happen naturally because of gravity was when my elbow was lower than the balance point, which then counterbalanced the weight of the tip. And so that is actually able to control the weight and the lift of the bow, the heaviness and the lightness to the bow by adding or subtracting the ballast of the arm. And notice my shoulders not having to lift, right? So that's very easy to do. I can make a much louder sound easier, but the friction that's naturally there is so wonderful and so easy to use. So this is why I like the Capet method, or the Capet way of playing, the French school especially. It's very easy on the arm and it's very efficient. Okay, so now let's talk a little bit about these other movements. What is the responsibility of the elbow? So the elbow is the elevator. It moves you from string to string, correct? Now, what if that elbow is also up here? It moves in the same kind of idea, but see how much harder it is? Like, I have some impingements going on right in here. To get from string to string, it's more difficult. So I guess you would use this part of the arm more. And this one where it's semi there, it's still very difficult to get from string to string. So if you lower all that, depending on what part of the bow you're in, there's different arm muscles that can do string changes and etc. So the elbow in the French method stays under the bow in the middle. The wrist then is used for string crossings. Sorry, in the middle. At the tip, it's an arm. String crossings come in different ways. Wrist here, and fingers here. This is a totally different movement. Okay, so what if my arm had to change? Like some teachers teach. The wrist changes, and the arm changes. Then you get the bow doing all kinds of motions on the string instead of just one motion back and forth. And then the whatever part of your arm it's a much more efficient way to play. And finally, let's talk about this last piece. This is all things that we need to think about before we can even talk about the first Capet exercise, because they're so important. And the more I teach, the more I realize that these very things are what causes 90% of my students' inability to make a good sound. So now let's talk about the arm. We know there are two muscles, or two bones here. One is the collarbone. Right here that goes all the way out. And then your arm is attached to the collarbone, which is just shoulder bone too, comes out here. Collarbone turns into shoulder bone. Okay, that's a bone that's across the top. You see this picture? That bone comes across here and then has a little edge on the side, and it has a little cup in the top there. And into that cup comes the ball and socket of the femur, and that rotates in there. And the rotations of that are around the body, like a ring around, like Saturn. That ring, that's what that movement is. So when you see students playing their bow in that ring, that just tells us that they're using their shoulder primarily to play. Okay, so in order to counterbalance that, we need an inverse curve that is exactly equivalent to the curve, the inward curve. We need an external curve that goes out. So if I were to show you, so the internal curve comes around the center like this, the external curve comes out like this. That's an exaggeration, but I'll show you on the instrument. So notice how the tip comes out. It's hard to see, but you can see the angle. Okay, and then the frog comes forward. Those are all natural movements. If my fingers are equivalent on the bow, and I don't grip the bow, then I don't have problems with the bow stick coming back here. So that is a very important part, a change that is very helpful. So relaxing the first finger. And then straightening the arm almost straight forward instead of coming back around like this, which creates an off angle. You want a perpendicular angle here. Even almost a smaller than perpendicular angle. So even a little bit smaller than that, coming back around to the middle. And that happens right at the tip. And then the frog continues in. And that's the only place where the bow hair is flat on the string, is when you do that little curve there. It's because that's the extreme of the inward movement, so you have to have an extreme of an outward movement to balance it out. So I hope that was helpful. Those are a lot of things we went through. I'm sure there's going to be a lot of questions. I'll probably make more videos to kind of detail each one of these places. But that's the long and the short of why I think that we should be using a balance way of playing with the bow, with our fingers, so that we can have interdependent but independent movements from each place in our hand, so that we can move those little pieces very easily and very well, and we don't contradict the movements that are happening. Plus, we're using our natural body movements. Our shoulders aren't lifting, our wrists aren't lifting too much, we're not impinging on nerves, causing a lot of damage or cut off circulation. And there's freedom of movement, because when you play like that, that's like sitting on the swing. You put all your weight into the swing, right? And then let go. And it's just so easy to make sound. Okay? All right. Well, keep working on those bow divisions, and I will see you at our next podcast, videocast episode. Ciao.